If you look behind me here, this is a little makeshift cattle panel greenhouse that we just threw together, and this is something I've been wanting to try for a long time. You can find a lot of videos of makeshift greenhouses like this out there on the internet. But basically just we got inspiration from a ton of videos online and kind of cobbled together something on our own with some used materials, some materials we had to purchase. And we're learning as we go, but I want to go over the basic gist of how we got it constructed and kind of how I think about using this in the nursery for propagation purposes. You can kind of make them any size you want. This one's roughly 16 feet long, roughly 6 feet or so wide, and roughly, I don't know, 7 feet tall, rough dimensions. It cost us about $300 in materials, and so far it's been working really good. I'll go to the building part next. That part is very simple. Anybody can do it. You don't have to be super skilled with carpentry or construction skills. This doesn't have to be pretty. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to stand up. So we'll go over that. Like I said, that's the simple part. For me, the part that's a little bit more complicated is operating the greenhouse. It's not something that you can just set and forget, especially in spring and fall when the temperature fluctuations, ambient temperature fluctuates pretty widely. Throughout a lot of winter and summer, you probably can sort of set this and forget it. But when we get into these swing seasons, there is a lot of user input that is required to really make this space thrive. All right, so if you want to replicate this yourself, do something similar, this is the basic process that we followed. You need a frame on the ground. We made ours out of wood. There's probably other material you could use for this. We elected to use scrap wood that we had laying around. I think the biggest consideration you should have when picking wood for this frame is that the frame is in contact with the ground, it's going to rot. So using something that's rot resistant, either pressure treated or perhaps black locust or white oak, some sort of rot resistant wood would be good. You're going to need some sort of material that can act as a post or a stake. We used pieces of rebar. We got them kind of longer because they're cheaper long, and then we cut them. You could use T-posts. You could fabricate wooden stakes. There's all sorts of material you could use for this, but we used rebar. Now, perhaps the most important piece, this is the one piece that we had to buy, was cattle panel. We got this type of cattle panel. It comes in lengths that are 16 feet long by about 50 inches wide. Each piece being 50 inches wide, that's kind of the unit of measurement for how long your greenhouse is going to be. If you get 4 cattle panels like we did, your total length is going to be 4 times 50 inches. This is Gravy coming to inspect my work, make sure I'm not cutting any corners. When it comes to getting these cattle panels, you can get them at your local farm supply store. Watch a video on how to fit them into the back of a truck, into the bed of a pickup truck, if that's what you're going to do. It's very easy to do, but there's a specific technique. There's a lot of good videos out there showing you how to do it. Otherwise, you're going to want a trailer that's pretty long because these things are 16 feet. But again, just to emphasize, they can easily be squeezed into the bed of a truck that's only about 6 feet long. Like I said, we wanted our greenhouse to be about 16 feet long. I didn't have any pieces of wood that were long enough, so I spliced a few pieces of wood together by using a third piece of wood kind of as a clamp or a splice. I just screwed a bunch of screws into it, kind of holding these two together. This does not need to be super fancy. It does not need to look pretty. It doesn't need to be perfect. If you want perfect, you're probably better off buying a greenhouse kit, and there's nothing wrong with that, but if you want to do something that is cheap, affordable, easy to DIY, this is what we're talking about. So again, using scrap materials, we bought the cattle panel, we bought the rebar, but we were working with scrap pieces of wood that we had, so we had to do that splice. So the length of the greenhouse is determined by how many cattle panels you buy. The width and the height of the ceiling are determined by you. The wider you go, the lower the ceiling will be. The narrower you go, the taller the ceiling will be. So you can stand one of the cattle panels up to kind of get a rough guess. If I have the cattle panel spread this wide, can I walk under it, that sort of thing. And then once you're fully decided on your length and your width, you're going to build your frame. You're going to pound some stakes in on either side of the frame to lock it in place so that it can't slide around. And then you're going to stand up your cattle panels. It's real easy to bend them in place. It's much easier if you have 2 people. And then there's a couple different ways you could secure them together. We use tie wire. You could use zip ties, but you just want to make sure that they're securely fastened to each other. And as long as they're fastened to each other and as long as your frame is solidly locked in by those stakes, the cattle panels shouldn't go anywhere. Next, we just cobbled together a little door frame and kind of tie wired the cattle panels to the door frame. This gives it a little bit of extra rigidity. I should note, we're in a climate where we don't really get much snow, and so if you're in an area that gets a lot of snow, you may have to consider snow load. We don't have to do that here, so this minimal construction should be good enough. If this falls apart in the future, I'll be sure to let you guys know, but I think it's going to be A-okay. Next, you're going to want to get your plastic, spread it out long ways, and then start draping it over the greenhouse. Like the rest of the steps in this process, it's much easier if you have 2 people for this part, but you spread the plastic over, get it tight, and then we're going to clamp it down. I'll talk more about clamping the plastic in a minute. Make sure when you're buying or sourcing your plastic that you're getting greenhouse plastic that's rated for UV exposure. If you use plastic that's not rated for UV exposure, it will degrade and come apart into pieces very quickly. If you peek around on Marketplace and Craigslist, you may be able to find used greenhouse plastic that a farmer's getting rid of. It may be kind of some odd sizes. You can get this stuff used. We went to buy it new. There's a few different options for securing the plastic to the greenhouse. One idea is just to use big heavy weights to make sure that the plastic is weighed down. We went with a combination of weights and also wooden clamps you can see here. We hold the plastic in place tight and then we screw long boards into the frame to kind of lock the plastic in. This is putting a hole in the plastic, but it's also clamping it down pretty securely. I like this method. We also do use some big weights on the end because right now we have not finished fabricating our door. And so we're just using big concrete blocks to kind of hold the plastic down around the door frame. It's the basic gist of how we put this sucker together. If you've got questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm very happy to share my thoughts on this process. There's probably a few things I missed. Again, don't feel like you've got to copy this exactly. This is just what we did. You know, tweak it to make it fit your site, your preferences, your thing. The major thing to consider in terms of operating the greenhouse is that it's going to get very, very hot in here on a sunny day. Today it's in the 50s. This is probably not the appropriate thermometer for this. This is a refrigerator thermometer. You can see it kind of taps out at 80 degrees. So I don't know how accurate this is at this temperature, but it's hot in here. And we've had it open for the past few hours on both ends. So the basic gist is that pretty quickly on a day when it's anything above 40 and fully sunny, it's gonna get hot in here. You might wanna consider opening up doors, letting airflow through the greenhouse. The flip side is that at a certain point in the afternoon, you're going to want to close it up to conserve heat so that you can build enough heat for staying warm all night. We don't have any sort of heater in here, although you could run a little space heater. I'm sure we're pretty close to a power outlet. You could have compost piles in here generating heat to kind of help maintain the space throughout the winter. I mostly look at this space as a season extension. So I'm not trying to grow tomatoes all winter long. I'm trying to be able to start plants earlier in the season than I would be able to if I had to rely on waiting for the last frost date. So down here on the ground, my audio got a little bit goofed up here, but the main point that I was trying to convey is that you can use a greenhouse for various purposes, and the level of heat and climate control you need is going to vary based on what your goals are. For me, the major goal is to have a frost-free space to propagate seedlings before my last frost date. There's a lot of demand for plants after the last frost date, and so being able to have plants ready to go ahead of time is really valuable as a nursery. Additionally, having a climate-controlled space like this is very helpful for germinating small seeded plants. Basically, it's just difficult to start small seeded plants outdoors in the elements, and so having this protected space is very nice for that, regardless of season. In addition to, the frost protection, this also protects us against wind and rain, and so I can keep the moisture level of these seedlings pretty adequate without worrying about, wind or rain hammering down on the little trays. Again, really the biggest thing is just managing temperature, humidity, and water for your seedlings, opening the greenhouse when it needs to be opened, closing it when it needs to be closed. Depending how cold it gets, you can actually add additional layers of plastic above, and that will help it actually get hotter and stay hotter. It's additional insulation, and it's trapping more, it's doing more greenhouse effect theoretically by having additional layers of plastic. So if it's going to get really cold, you might want to play around with that. This is a type of thing where it's hard to give specific instructions or directions. If it hits X temperature, do this. You're gonna have to play with it in your environment and see what happens. I'm still really learning as I go here in this tunnel greenhouse, whatever you wanna call it. But that's the basic gist, and we'll keep you guys up to date as we kind of learn some lessons, as we fill this space out and really have a lot of plants propagated in here. We'll keep you up to date. It's gonna be an interesting ride. I guess one last thing, it also might be valuable just to talk about what I've done in years past without this sort of greenhouse. Is I've mostly just done native trees. Well, not entirely native, but mostly just done trees and woody species in the nursery. And I've primarily distributed bare root in the fall. So under that context, there's no need to have a greenhouse space to start plants early. I wasn't really doing many sales in the spring. All the trees can wake up on their own after the last frost date outside. Most of the tree species, the seed is large, and so I don't need a very protected, delicate space to start the seeds. I can mulch them heavily and they'll pop up through it. The mulch kind of maintains the moisture. Compared to smaller seeds, now there are some trees that have smaller seeds, You really have to be on top of weeding and water management because those seeds, you can't mulch them very thickly when they're very itty bitty small seeds. So this year, really with the greenhouse, two things are new. Again, I'm trying to start a lot of species that have small seeds. So I'm diversifying species. Those small seeded species, I want to start them in a space where I can control the moisture, control weeds very easily here. That's what the greenhouse is helping to facilitate. And I'm trying to have a lot more potted plants and kind of meet some of that spring demand, get some cash flow in the spring. And so I have a desire to have plants ready earlier than I typically would have had trees in the past, where I was focusing most of my effort on fall sales. So I'll still be doing a lot, if not more, fall sales, but I'm going to also try to be doing some spring stuff here locally. If anyone's around in the Roanoke area, we're going to be at the Roanoke Farmers Market there in Grandin, the Salem Farmers Market, and a couple times a year we'll hit Rocky Mount, maybe a few other places in the area with potted plants. We also still somewhat regularly travel down into North Carolina to the old site in Cedar Grove, and so if you're near Cedar Grove, Hillsborough, Durham, we can distribute potted plants down there as well. Hopefully we're going to have this whole thing filled up with potted plants within a week or so, a few days. I don't know the exact timeline, but hopefully quickly this will fill up with potted plants, trays, all that stuff. We're probably going to build some tables and work benches in here, and then before we know it, we're going to be past the last frost date and we'll have tons more plants outside. But that's the basic gist on how I see this greenhouse. It's giving you a season extension if you want to start plants. It's giving me a protected space to start seedlings, easier to maintain moisture and temperature and all these sorts of things in here. And additionally, if you wanted to have plants that don't grow in your zone, they're not hardy enough, you can push the season here. You could have some plants that are a little bit more sensitive to frost, keep them in here as long as you're able to keep the temperature that they want. You could keep certain things alive all winter that outside you wouldn't be able to. I just personally haven't experimented with that a whole lot yet. Definitely looking forward to experimenting with in the future now that we have this space. I'd love to have some of the more tropical plants, be able to keep them alive throughout the winter time. There's going to be, like I said, a lot of management operating of the greenhouse to maintain ideal conditions for those sorts of plants, but it's doable. I have some friends down in North Carolina near Durham. It's a little bit warmer there, but not dramatically compared to where we're at here. And they keep pepper plants alive all winter. Now, they're not producing peppers all winter. The plants are definitely go somewhat dormant, but they stay alive in a low tunnel greenhouse like this with multiple layers of plastic. The plastic has to come on and off depending on if it's hotter or colder and that sort of thing. It's a lot of work, but it is doable. You can certainly push your zone with a space like this. And again, for $300 and half a day's work, this is pretty accessible to a lot of people. I know finances are pretty tight for a lot of us right now. $300 can go pretty far towards other things. It's not a small amount of money to a lot of us, but compared to spending thousands of dollars on a greenhouse kit or a more quote-unquote professional greenhouse, it's a pretty good deal. It's a really good investment of resources, I think. Perfect example of what I've been talking about. I've been here potting up some of these little service berries. I've got them growing in these little communal beds. That's kind of the workflow, is start a bunch of seeds in these flats, pluck them out, plop them into pots. We can talk more about that at another time, but the main gist is that I've been in here working for an hour or two, kind of lost track of time. It's starting to cool off in here. The temperature still says it's pretty hot, but I can feel it's cooler in here than when I started, and we only have about an hour and a half of direct sun before it starts to get low below the hill. It'll still be bright for another few hours longer, but as the sun starts to get low, that heat is less intense, and so I closed the flaps up here. I want to build some heat. It's not supposed to freeze tonight, but I all these plants, they won't die unless it gets below freezing, but they'll grow faster if it's warmer. I've got some willow cuttings here, some elderberry cuttings, and with a little bit of added heat, they will grow faster, especially these figs. Trying my hand at rooting some of these fig cuttings. We'll see how it goes. And so having heat through the night will help. So we're just trying to build a little bit of thermal battery capacity, so to speak. Closing the flaps, going to keep on potting here. As you can see, the wind blew the flaps open there. I'm going to have to make some adjustments. All closed up for the night. You can see there is a little bit of a gap here, but since it's not going to freeze tonight, that's not a huge deal. If it was going to freeze, I'd want to probably clip that together somehow.